In a previous session, we learned of the ignorance of man, our preference to return to what we are more comfortable with than what is real, even if we are staring directly at it. In this lesson, we will learn that not only do degrees provide progressive moral teachings, but that within the degrees the same exist. That ignorance in any one part of the degree is ignorance in it as a whole. Our failure of the cave dwellers to grow and learn, they voluntarily chose to remain in darkness, staring only at the shadows on the wall. This life in perpetual darkness is what Masonry is here to help us eliminate. Unfortunately, most do not and will not ever achieve it. The lies which fill society and life are too overwhelming for most. Their preordained conceiving of reality, their teachings in their childhood, their indoctrination in the school system will never allow them to open themselves to what is truly good. The practicing Mason needs to study philosophy, the classics, and the great literature to even begin to grasp the concepts of craft Masonry, just like in the previous session. Today we search another section, which we learn is described as the divine attribute and the foundation of every virtue. When it comes to the first degree, we learn of truth. In that connection, truth, which is called a divine attribute, the foundation of every virtue, is synonymous with sincerity, honesty of expression, and plain dealing, from Mackey's Revised Encyclopedia of Freemasonry. We also learn truth is one of the three principal tenets of our order, brotherly love and relief being the other two. To be true and trusty is one of the first lessons in which an aspirant is instructed. All other things are mortal and transitory, but truth alone is immutable and eternal. It is the attribute of him in whom there is no variableness, nor shadow of changing. Lexicon of Freemasonry. In the Entered Apprentice's lecture, we learn of truth as the foundation of every virtue. To be good men and true is the first lesson, etc. But these teachings regarding the third principal tenet are of truth in its narrower and more restricted sense. That use of the word as a synonym for sincerity, right dealing, absence of deceit, honesty of expression, and straightforwardness. Truth is the foundation of all the degrees, which will ultimately lead you to looking more strongly on the truth of your faith, not your religion or your religious philosophy, but your faith itself. In the first degree, we are being taught to open our hearts, for without doing so we will forever be blind to the truth in front of us. In the second degree, we are taught to open our minds, for an unlearned man is a man doomed to forever live in ignorance, forever live in a deplorable state of being. And in the third, we are taught to open our souls, for without doing so we will forever be doomed to mortality and personal unhappiness throughout our mortal lives. Let us start with the honesty of expression portion of the aforementioned definition. W. Kirk McNulty, in the book The Way of the Craftsman, A Search for the Spiritual Essence of Craft Freemasonry, under the chapter of conscientiousness, defines honesty of expression better than anywhere else I could find it. He states, "Honesty has been understood as a commitment to find the truth and to live according to it. Honesty as a virtue means refusing any falsification of the facts. Honesty is the most remarkable expression of self-respect and other respect, without any concessions to self-deception or other deception." It is far from easy to define a virtue like honesty, since philosophers have ascribed to it such a varied content, and we must therefore start by establishing its limits and defining its essence. One common feature of all references to honesty is to understand it as a virtue, in other words, as a character trait developed over time by one's own will. As occurs with other virtues, we can state that nobody is born honest or becomes to be so by violating some aspect of his or her being. Persons become honest on the basis of a proposition that is put into practice over a long period of time. From among the different definitions given by philosophers of the virtue of honesty, two positions can be established. The first, the virtue of honesty understood as the commitment to seek the truth and to live in accordance with it. And the second, the virtue of honesty understood as being contrary to the falsification of facts. Without treating these two points of view on honesty as mutually exclusive, it can be argued that whereas the former appears to cover all aspects of human life, the latter is decidedly closer to the virtue of sincerity and refers more specifically to the facet of human relationships whereby things are communicated to others just as these things have been observed and are known. Honesty conceived of as the awareness of that which is appropriate for personal behavior and relationships with others becomes the virtue that one must assume in all behavior, which is just, bold, brave, and prudent. The interrelationship between the cardinal virtues and honesty has perhaps not been sufficiently emphasized, yet it is clear to see we call honest the person who possesses the four cardinal virtues. In fact, the defense made by classical thought of the virtues can only be maintained by affirming that the honest man only becomes so through possession of the cardinal virtues, since this honest quality can only come about by cultivating these basic virtues. Perhaps a distinction can be made between the virtue of honesty and the virtue of truth-seeking, but not with the commitment to live in accordance with the truth. After all, lived experience refers to behavior, which is the terrain of virtue itself. For this reason, some authors regard honesty as the disposition to live in the light, a clear allusion to the true practical knowledge that is transferred to the terrain of praxis. In this regard, a lack of honesty would not imply erroneous knowledge, but, rather, knowledge that, while remaining true, is not transformed into pertinent acts. Honesty is as necessary for everyday life as are the cardinal virtues. Since the description of someone as honest refers to the integrity of behavior, we cannot state that a person is honest in some activities but not in others. For instance, to live honestly is to live in accordance with the ideas of authenticity that are revealed through one's acts. Rosalind Hirschhaus asks what we would expect from someone regarded as having the virtue of honesty to be like. Commonly we think they would be reliable in their behavior, that they wouldn't steal, and that they wouldn't pretend to be more knowledgeable than they really are. In everyday language, we say of someone that you know where you stand with him or her, that there are no hidden surprises or ulterior motives. James Taper Pace, the character in Iris Murdoch's novel, The Bell, is an honorable man who lives as he thinks, who thinks in accordance with the principles of his religion, and who says what he really thinks. In his life, this character is surrounded by people who find it difficult to remain honest because, for one reason or another, what they do falls far short of what they feel or think. Here we might recall Aristotle's distinction between the acratic and encratic man, i.e., a person who maintains through the force of will a desire that is contrary to reason, where he refers to the virtuous man as he who shows in his behavior that internal accord which gives rational order to the desires in the service of good ends. Integrity is one of the characteristic features of an honest man, because one finds no contradictions in him, nor in his acts, his thoughts, or in his words he addresses to others or to himself. Virtuous, honest, and man are thus different words that indicate a single reality. As St. Thomas Aquinas puts it in his Article 1 of Question 145, a thing that is said to be honest through being worthy of honor, and honor is due to excellence, in other words, to virtue. Properly speaking, honesty refers to the same thing as virtue. In a slightly more restrictive sense, honesty is understood as the virtue of rejecting the falsification of real facts in our dealings with others. Several questions arise from this point of view. For instance, whether being honest is compatible with white lies, or whether the virtue of honesty obliges us to communicate all of our most intimate thoughts and feelings to those we love. Honesty defined as the virtue of telling the truth challenges, to an extent, what we have stated so far as regards honesty and leads us to consider, as does Solomon, that truth and honesty are never absolute, and, in certain cases, honesty may not even be a virtue. Thus, telling the truth when this is done in order to manipulate or cause harm cannot be understood as an honorable act. As Aristotle says, the ends of our acts specify them in moral terms. Other authors, in contrast, make the appropriateness of telling the truth depend on the consequences that will follow from doing so. However, Solomon's argument is that if every act of telling the truth is considered to be honorable, then this paves the way to condone cruel behavior and irresponsible criticism. The strict absolutist position would be that one still ought to tell, if there's anything to tell. The consequentialist would say that of course one should not tell, since no good could possibly come of it. And against any moral decision that does not take into consideration elements other than the moral law, Solomon concludes, if both of us were totally honest, there could not possibly be any relationship at all, if for no other reason than because we would both continually bore and offend each other past the limits of endurance. Telling the truth also has to do with reality and our capacity to relate to this. Saying something which is not the case not only reveals a lack of respect towards others, who we then use according to our own needs, but also indicates that we ascribe to reality less ontological weight than it actually has. The nature of the facts and of the language becomes perverted by the interest of whomever falsifies reality by means of the communicated word. Honesty, properly understood, also begins with oneself. An interest in self-knowledge and the ability to analyze one's own behavior are indicative of someone who wishes to be frank with him or herself. Clarity as regards the limits in what is sought, and avoiding self-complacency and self-deceit are the three hallmarks of the honest person. The iconographic image used by the artist to illustrate both prudence and truth, a woman looking at herself in a mirror, would also serve to represent honesty, where this entails delving into the meaning of life so as to infuse everyday life with a full awareness and knowledge of personal being. The action of the honest person is an action within the appropriate limits made conscious by the protagonist. The person driven by the masses who follows the objectives set by the external authorities does not fit with the image of the honest person. The echo of a person's honest treatment of himself can be heard in the honesty in which he treats others. The sincerity that defines the way in which the honest man treats himself is the same as that which presides over his relationship with others, and is not merely a matter of sincerity, but, rather, one of authenticity and coherence. Acting in accordance with one's most intimate convictions and the most basic principles is, in the words of Jacinto Choza, the most significant aspect of the ethical attitude of authenticity. However, authenticity cannot be defined solely in terms of this coherence between what one thinks and what one does. For if the person who thinks is perverse, then one would be grateful if that person were to be inauthentic. Thus, honesty implies an authenticity in which a person's behavior is consistent with a set of morally good convictions and principles. Honesty is the most notable expression of self-respect and respect for others. It is the commitment to avoid falling into self-deceit or deceiving others to favor our own interest. The trust of others and the recognition of a person's worth are the recompense for this virtue, even though it is not this recompense that motivates the virtuous man. Furthermore, and as Kant pointed out, expecting that such recompense will accompany a virtuous act may entail waiting in vain and lead to disappointment. The honest person may not receive any more recompense than his own, that is, the satisfaction of knowing that he has acted according to the dictates of his integrity, despite knowing full well that in the name of this integrity, when sure but mistaken, any number of foolish deeds may have been committed. But we are not speaking of the virtue of honesty that always goes hand in hand with the virtue of prudence. People trust the honest person because he has come to deserve that others expect of him that his actions will be a true reflection of what he thinks and says. In essence, honesty is the outward expression of oneself in everyday life. The happy will be happy in their actions with subversive undertones or grumbling away from the act, while the frustrated would demonstrate the like, expressing their frustration. Both are being equally honest, and both would be equally worthy of the same respect. However, the person who is happy for want of reward, recognition, or merit is a dishonest person, as much so as the man whose frustration only exists for not receiving such benefits or acclaim. Their behavior are in contradiction to their emotions, as their end means is for nothing more than reward. So when we look at what it is we are to learn in the first degree, we are talking not just about our personal interactions, the most basic level of truth, but our outward expressions of those actions. We're also talking about the constant search for truth, as Brother Mackey spent most of his life examining and exploring. To examine this idea more fully, we will use the quote and example given to us by an esteemed brother of the craft, Albert Pike. A man may be a good sort of man in general, and yet a very bad man in particular. Good in the lodge and bad in the world, good in public and bad in his family, good at home and bad on a journey or in a strange city. Many a man earnestly desires to be a good Mason. He says so, and is sincere. But if you require him to resist a certain passion, to sacrifice a certain indulgence, to control his appetite at a particular feast, or to keep his temper in dispute, you will find that he does not wish to be a good Mason in that particular case, or, wishing, is not able to resist his worst impulses. This is the most misrepresented and quoted line in the history of Freemasonry. It is used in jurisdictions and by individuals to control the speech and actions of its constituent members for two reasons. 1. People are unaware of where the quote originates, the 9th degree or Elu of 9 of the ancient accepted Scottish Rite. And secondly, that Pike gives examples of the type of person or persons to whom he is referring. And it is a representation of exactly that which we are discussing today in the idea of truth. Those basic premises which we are supposed to use to govern our actions by: sincerity, right dealing, absence of deceit, and straightforwardness. Pike continues in his dialogue from before. It wars against the passions that spring out of the bosom of a world of fine sentiments, a world of admirable sayings and foul practices, of good maxims and bad deeds, whose darker passions are not only restrained by custom and ceremony, but hidden even from itself by a veil of beautiful sentiments. This terrible solecism has existed in all ages. Romish sentimentalism has covered infidelity and vice. Protestant straightness often lauds spirituality and faith, and neglects homely truth, candor, and generosity. An ultra-liberal rationalistic refinement sometimes soars to heaven in its dreams, and wallows in the mire of earth in its deeds. Let's begin by examining the idea in Romish sentimentalism has often covered infidelity and vice. When Pike wrote this, the ideas of nationalism and patriotism were new and maybe unknown to him. After all, they only made their way into the dictionary in 1865, and this passage was published in 1861. However, the idea of Roman sentimentalism, the militaristic communal notion of Roman or any nation's military superiority over an individual man while abroad, the notion of one who felt that while not at home could not be condemned for any of the misdeeds and vices committed. It's an idea that has existed in the military forever, since its earliest days, and even exists today. War trophies, a false feeling of superiority over non-combatants, rape, murder, prostitution, and any array of the false sense of self-entitlements people abroad feel they can do, without remuneration, not here on earth, but during their judgment by St. Peter at the pearly gates. Masonry, at one time, even confronted this very issue directly. A soldier, for well more than 100 years, was required to receive a second charge at initiation, which read, as taken from Daniel Sickles' Ahim Razan, 7th edition, published in 1881. Brother, our institution breathes a spirit of general philanthropy. Its benefits and its social points of view are extensive. In the most enduring ties, it unites all mankind in every nation, wherever civilization extends, and not unfrequently among the wild savages of the forest. It opens an asylum to a brother in distress, and grants hospitality to the necessitous and unfortunate. The sublime principles of universal goodness and love to all mankind, which are essential to it, cannot be lost in national distinctions, prejudices, or animosities. The rage of contest and the sanguinary conflict have, by its recognized principles, been abated, and the milder emotions of humanity substituted. It has often performed the part of the angel of goodness, in ministering to the wants of the sick, the wounded, and the unfortunate prisoner of war. It has even taught the pride of victory to give way to the dictates of an honorable connection. In whatever country you travel, when you meet a Mason, you will find a brother and a friend who will do all in his power to serve you, and who will relieve you should you be poor or in distress, to the utmost of his ability, and with a ready cheerfulness. And it will always be expected that you, my brother, should lay down your pride and perform the same. This second charge was only removed post-World War II as the Cold War ramped up and the ideas of civilized warfare were introduced in the Hague Treaty, and under the false presumption that World War II was truly the war to end all wars. However, the evil actions that Brother Pike refers to still exist today. It's something that's commonly seen, especially overseas. That is, of course, unless you choose to wear blinders and forego reality. It makes no never mind your approach, be it by excuses, rationalization, dismissiveness, arrogance, or just ignorance. One is either for or against any illicit behavior or actions, and anyone who's against one action, yet attempts to okay the actions of another because of Romish sentimentalism, is just not being honest, neither in their words nor in their actions. When Brother Pike continues with the line, Protestant straightness often lauds spirituality and faith, and neglects homely truth, candor, and generosity, he speaks of something not oft spoken of in the history of the Western world, what was, and in many places is still, the mire of Western religion. We know and learn of Jewish persecution from the earliest days of Egypt. Moses, the parting of the Red Sea, and the pursuit by Pharaoh is not only mentioned directly in the degree and in the Bible, shown in the movies, but also taught in school as part of ancient Egyptian history. However, especially in America, the persecution of the Catholics has long been drowned in falsified history committed by a loose conglomeration of Protestant religious faiths, who are guilty of many more atrocities glazed over or corrupted entirely by historical fantasy. We are not even safe from this in Masonry, particularly among some mainstream York Rite Masons in the U.S., who, while building a foundation around a portion of Catholic history, some even exclude the very same Catholics from within their ranks. While we are discussing the idea of truth, which leads to the idea of faith over religion in the third degree, we are informed in the second to learn our history. One of our leading misrepresentations is the idea of the Inquisition, where the evil Catholics in the Catholic Church tortured and murdered millions, maybe tens of millions of innocent non-Catholics. Too bad this untruth has so invaded our psyche, or else we could learn a valuable lesson. Were you aware that there were two separate and distinct Inquisitions? The one we all know, run by the Papal State and the Holy Roman Empire, of course. And if you're not aware, the Holy Roman Empire didn't dissolve until 1806. The Papal Inquisition was very strict with the idea of allowing lost and confused souls to find their way back to Catholicism and be redeemed. It wasn't all tulips and daisies, but torture was banned in this Inquisition. As a matter of fact, torture had been banned in the Papal Inquisition since 1328 and the release of the approved directive of Inquisition procedures put out by the Papal Bull, named the Directorum Inquisitorium. Now I know you're thinking, you're wrong, that's not true. We know torture happened in burnings in Catholic states, we have records, and of course you are right. But these inquisitions were run not by the Church, but by the governments of independent states, such as Spain, where King Ferdinand instituted the Inquisition to suppress the Calvinist uprising, which led to the death of some 12 million Catholic farmers between 1524 and 1530. As a matter of fact, the estimation is the primary three Protestant religions, Calvinists, Lutherans, and Church of England, massacred more than 100 million Catholics over the next 150 years. It was this which led to the growth of the state-sanctioned inquisitions and the reintroduction of torture and the Dark Ages of Europe. But we never learned this, correct? And that's where we're all wrong. We did learn this, all of this, just with the part of the Protestant uprising left out. Maybe you recognize some of the wars that were Protestant against Catholic. The German Peasants' War of 1524 to 1525, the Wars of Kappel in the Old Swiss Confederacy from 1529 to 1531, the Schmalkaldic War from 1546 to 1547 in the Holy Roman Empire, the 80 Years' War from 1568 to 1648 in the Low Countries, the French Wars of Religion, known now as the French War for Independence from 1562 to 1598, the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648, affecting the Holy Roman Empire, including Habsburg, Austria, and Bohemia, France, Denmark, and Sweden. The Wars of the Three Kingdoms from 1639 to 1651, affecting England, Scotland, and Ireland. The English Civil War, Irish Confederate Wars, and the Cromwellian conquest of Ireland. And later wars, such as the 9 Years' War from 1688 to 1697. And of course it didn't stop there, and neither does the misinformation. After all, the oppressed Protestant religions found their way out of persecution to the land of opportunity, the New World, where they set up independent colonies secluded to religious sects and the worship of, not God, but their particular religions. And they brought with them the same practices, but they were advanced enough to give it a new guise, known as the witchcraft trials. And I know those brains be churning now, and all of you are thinking, Salem, 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 or Old Hallows Eve. But this isn't the case. The American witch hunts occurred throughout the Protestant Americas from 1530 through 1750, and it wasn't just restricted there. All British colonies practiced it, from Australia to India to British-held territories in Asia and Africa, and they used a worldwide best-selling book named the Malleus Maleficarum for their procedure manual, which was published around 1515, and 3 existing copies are currently on display at Cornell University Library, with a list of tens of thousands of convicted witches in the Ithaca, New York area alone. When discussing this, it's important to keep in mind that this time period was the colonized New World and pre-America. The colonies were mostly independent communes set up in religious factions, be it Shakers, Quakers, Puritan, Lutherans, or Calvinists, etc. Their laws were mostly the religious laws of their independent colony and carried out by the Protestant religious leaders and or the religion-endorsed legal system, where judges were chosen by the religious elders to subjugate the accused to not only the penalties of the law, but to the penalties of the mores and norms of their particular religion. Domestic violence and the lack of respect for spouses and children were common occurrences throughout the colonial world in the Protestant religions. We have court records which can still be read today, which show us how things worked in the colonies, such as the case of Jane and Samuel Holloway from the Plymouth Criminal Records, where Jane Holloway abused both publicly and privately her husband and was legally sentenced to 3 slashes of the whip for what's termed today as battery. However, Samuel Holloway was also sentenced under Puritan moral codes, in the same case by the same judgment, to public humiliation for not being a man, where he was publicly berated by being tied to a post for 7 days while the members of the community pelted him with rotten food and stones. And this is not a rare one-off example, as 20% of all domestic abuse cases in Plymouth Colony on record were committed by women against their husbands and children. Other records from other colonies are no different and are completely contradictory to most of our worldly perceptions of colonial America. Now, while many might think that this is in the past and we have advanced, well, for that I'll quote you a lesson from Proverbs, which is alluded to in the 2nd degree. As a dog returneth to his vomit, so returneth a fool to his folly. Religious persecution still occurs today, and while the methodology has changed, the end results are the same. bashing and public humiliation of those who have a different religious viewpoint than yours. From here, Pike continues with ultra-liberal rationalistic refinement sometimes soars to heaven in its dreams and wallows in the mire. Now let me be very clear. In the ritual, when liberalism is mentioned, it's not referring to liberal as in the modern political structures. It's referring to what is known as classical liberalism, and it's directing you to some great philosophers and great books that it wants you to learn, such as, but not limited to, Thomas Hobbes' The Leviathan, written in 1651, John Locke's Two Treatises, written in 1690, Aristotle's Organon, written in 563 BC, Robert Filmer's Patriarcha, written in 1680, and John Milton's Areopagitica, written in 1644. If you must refer to a modern ideology which expresses these ideas, you will see that it's the political ideology that represents the most extreme forms of modern-day libertarianism in their pages, warning us specifically about empowering the state. But no, Pike is referring to the scourge of his modern society, the idea of good over the rationalistic approach to good. Actual liberalism, a form not much different than what it is today, but we must understand that in Pike's days, two forms of liberalism were appearing on the world stage and competing for recognition and acceptance. The first, British liberalism, also known as Robin Hood liberalism, and I think the name suggests how it works. Second, French liberalism, an even bigger scourge on society, where the belief is the peasants should rise and revolt and take for themselves what they feel they deserve. Both exist today. British liberalism in modern-day terminology brought us the New Deal, welfare, obscene and contradictory environmental laws, union mandation, Obamacare, massive interference in the governing of our own lives, massive taxation and loss of property rights, etc. French liberalism paved the way for such great ideas as the Nazis, the fascists, communists, Stalinist book burnings, political correctness, which is the complete opposite of the straightforwardness Masonry is teaching us in this degree, Antifa and the Holocaust, and many other things. But let's stay outside the politics on this one, kind of, and instead we'll use the example of the Great Recycling Myth. We know recycling does no good to the environment. It has a worldwide global impact that actually puts more greenhouse gases into the environment than what it saves. Even longtime supporters and proponents of such programs have been forced to admit as much, whether we refer to the HuffPost or the New York Times or news media. However, no matter how much information is put out there, studies like a 10-year study by Princeton University, which ran from 1998 to 2009, found people would go to extreme measures in home garbage pickup and recycling methods, even if they had to sort out 15 different colors and sizes of plastic into 15 different containers. Why? Because this way they could sit in their homes and convince themselves they were doing something good for the earth and or for the environment, even if they had the facts of its harmfulness placed directly in front of them. The Princeton and many other studies of the same nature have found that the actions are not propelled by selflessness, but by selfishness, a way for an individual to do almost nothing but convince themselves they are doing well for the greater cause. This is what Pike is referring to when he says ultra-liberal rationalistic refinement sometimes soars to heaven in its dreams and wallows in the mire of earth in its deeds. We use different phrases to represent similar thoughts today, wacko, alt, extremeless. As Pike suggests, when we approach from emotion instead of rational thought, the effects outweigh the benefits. The rhetoric is emotionally or even philosophically appealing. It's called idealism, even though the end result, the approach of rationalism, will be built on in the trivium of the second degree, if you take the time to study it. We learn that the idealism, or the emotional approach, is an old argument, a false argument, meant to elicit emotional responses versus rational solutions. In his brilliant 1956 collection, Minority Report, journalist and satirist H. L. Mencken stated, "If you were against the New Deal and its wholesale buying of pauper votes, then you were against Christian charity. If you were against gross injustices and dishonesties of the Wagner Act, then you were against labor. If you were against packing the Supreme Court, then you were in favor of letting Wall Street do it. If you were against using Dr. Quack's cancer solve, then you were in favor of letting Uncle Julius die. If you're against Holy Church or Christian Science, then you're against God. It is an old argument. It's an old argument indeed, and one, despite its evident fallaciousness, still widely wielded and fallen for by the masses. We still hear these same arguments today. If you are against trade restrictions, you are against workers and high wages. If you're against minimum wages, then you're against the poor. If you're against paid family leave, then you're against families. If you are against Obamacare, then you are against affordable health care. If you are against government-set safety standards, then you are for letting people be poisoned and slaughtered indiscriminately. If you are against easy money, then you are for recessions. If you are against government-provided schooling, then you are against education of the masses. If you are against American militarism, then you are against world peace and for evil dictators. If you are against the war on drugs, then you are for the widespread dissoluteness and dissipation. If you are against licensing requirements for hair braiders, then you're obviously just about for people having to suffer from bad hairdos. In each of the previous examples, we are inundated with exactly the opposite of what Masonry teaches. However, the sincerity of those involved in the actions they take, what if you study the trivium and quadrivium that you are pushed to study in the second degree? Deceit, but more especially personal deceit, known as the sincerity of conviction. That idea where we believe it to be true or good, therefore it is so unquestionable by others, lest they be a bad person. A person against the moral welfare of society. Our convictions are right because we choose our own beliefs versus studying and examining the actual truth. We deceive ourselves and pass our deceit onto others who are willing to listen or that agree with us. Our words cover up our actions and become the more important and determining factor. We convince ourselves words are truth and that our convictions and actions are meaningless. In essence, we are not being truthful. We are not being honest, and therefore have not learned the very first lesson of the tenet of truth. In our final meaning, right dealing, we are led a bit astray. I have covered this in another presentation, which I gave on the usual interrogations. It's a short statement expressing a general truth, but a truth in a different field, one which pertains to law, contracts, and legal and business dealings and transactions. It is, of course, an important aspect of Masonry, and of each Mason's personal life. When you enter into the fraternity, you enter into a business arrangement with your lodge and ultimately your jurisdiction, or Grand Lodge. Both promise certain things, and both are expected and required to fill both of these obligations. It is through this example with which one would carry it into the outside world and conduct moral, ethical, and legal dealings with one another. So what are these promises? Well, a lodge promises to you fraternity, brotherhood, fellowship, a place for safe, open, and honest discussion on Masonry, lessons to help a man become a better man, charity towards brethren, support of brothers, widows, and orphans, rights and privileges in the lodge as prescribed by the Constitution and bylaws. In return, you make promises to your lodge, which are, every single one of these can be found verbatim in the ritual, many of them multiple times. To regard the volume of the sacred law as the unerring standard of truth and justice. Only mention God's name with reverence. Practice domestic and public virtues. Obedience to the laws under whose protection you live or reside. Strictly observing the constitution of the fraternity and the bylaws of your lodge. Adhering to the ancient landmarks. Studying Masonry and its ritual. Judging every trespass on the rules established in the volume of the sacred law. Preserving the ancient customs and usages of the fraternity. Enforcing its tenets. Never suffering our ancient landmarks under any pretense to be infringed. Never countenancing, admit as acceptable or possible any deviation from our established customs. Provide charity to your brethren in lodge. Support the widows and orphans of your brethren. Supply brotherhood to your brethren. Supply fraternity to your brethren. Supply fellowship to your brethren. Be subjected to the duties and responsibilities of your lodge. Yes, every one of those words on what you promise are written into the ritual. How many of us have broken one or more of them? How many of us here are in violation of one or more of them? How many have truly tried to live up to all of them? How many are guilty of failing to live up to the idea of right dealing among our brethren? Just think about that for a moment. How many of these have we all violated? And that now that each of us is aware, how can we correct it for the future? It is very important to remember that nothing in this presentation is here to get you to change your mind. It has only been presented to get you to open your mind, to realize that Masonry is a big world, and there are a lot of different viewpoints and a lot of different ideas that are within it. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Comment below and give us your opinions and your interpretations of what was presented here. And join us the next time. on Masonic Secrets Revealed.